You've probably felt it before, that quiet resistance, that invisible wall between you and the reality you want to create. You know what you want. You've visualized it, affirmed it, journaled it, maybe even meditated on it for weeks. And yet it doesn't happen. It's not that the universe isn't listening. It's not that your desire isn't valid. It's something far more subtle, far more personal. It's the one thing most people never think to examine: the ego. Not the loud, arrogant ego we talk about casually, but the deeper, quieter structure of identity that filters everything you allow to manifest. That's the real gatekeeper of your quantum reality. When you want to manifest something with ease, you're not really asking the universe for a favor. You're aligning yourself with a frequency that already exists. But the ego doesn't care about your future. It cares about survival. It thrives on familiarity, on being right, on keeping you exactly where you are. So when you start imagining a reality that doesn't match your current identity, your ego doesn't celebrate. It resists. It builds subtle thought patterns that tell you, it's not realistic, it's too risky, or you're not ready. And because these thoughts feel like your own voice, you believe them. That's where quantum manifestation gets blocked. Not because the field isn't responsive, but because you're unknowingly sending mixed signals. Imagine for a moment that your ego is like a loyal guard dog at the gate of a new timeline. It's not trying to sabotage you. It's trying to protect you from anything it perceives as unfamiliar territory. If you've always been the person who struggles with money, your ego identifies with that struggle. When you try to manifest abundance, your ego doesn't recognize it as safe. So instead of letting it in, it starts barking: doubt, fear, procrastination. You don't realize it's happening because the barking is happening in your own head. That's why so many people get stuck in a cycle, wanting something new, but staying emotionally anchored to the old. Quantum manifestation is instantaneous in the field, but not instantaneous in your experience, because your ego must be bypassed, softened, or reprogrammed before the new can integrate. It's like trying to plant a new seed in a soil that keeps spitting it out. The tricky part is ego resistance doesn't always feel like resistance. Sometimes it shows up as rational thinking. You say, I just need to be realistic. But what you're actually saying is, I'm loyal to my current identity more than my desired one. And in the quantum realm, the field responds to the identity you hold, not the words you speak. This is why affirmations often don't work for people. They're saying, I am wealthy, but their ego is screaming, no, you're not. And the frequency that gets broadcast is the scream, not the affirmation. To truly manifest with ease, you don't need to fight the ego. Fighting it only strengthens it. You need to see through it. You need to realize that the ego is not you. It's a temporary interface designed to help you navigate the physical world. When you begin observing it instead of obeying it, you weaken its grip. That's when the quantum field starts opening doors with less friction. Think of the ego like a radio stuck on an old station. If you want to tune into a new frequency, you can't just shout over the static. You have to gently turn the dial. The moment you do, the old station fades and the new one comes in clearly. But here's the twist. Most people try to turn the dial while still clinging to the old station emotionally. They want change, but they're afraid to let go of the familiar pain, and the ego feeds on that fear. You might wonder, but why would my ego block something good? Because your ego doesn't measure good or bad. It measures known versus unknown. The unknown, even if it's better, is perceived as unsafe. That's why people stay in jobs they hate, relationships that drain them, and patterns that keep them stuck. The ego whispers, better the devil you know. And that's how it keeps you looping in the same timeline, over and over again. The moment you decide to shift your frequency, your ego activates its defense system. It'll bring up old memories of failure, amplify the opinions of others, and remind you of every time something didn't work. It's not doing this because you're broken. It's doing this because change to the ego feels like death. And in a sense it is, a death of the old identity. Every quantum leap requires an ego death, not in a dramatic or scary way, but in a gentle unraveling of who you thought you had to be. This is why you can't manifest easily when you're tightly gripping an identity that doesn't match what you're calling in. You can't be both the caterpillar and the butterfly at the same time. The field responds when you let go, not when you beg. Ego begging is energetic resistance. Surrender, however, is pure alignment. When you understand this, manifestation stops being about making something happen and becomes about getting out of the way. The secret isn't about overpowering the ego but outgrowing it. When you identify more with the quantum self than the conditioned self, the ego naturally relaxes. It no longer needs to bark because it sees the new reality as safe. And when safety is perceived, resistance dissolves. That's when manifestation begins to feel effortless. What most people don't realize is that the ego isn't your enemy. It's a storyteller. It builds entire narratives around who you are, what's possible for you, and what's safe to believe. Those narratives become invisible cages. When you try to step into a new timeline, those cages rattle. Not because the universe is rejecting your vision, but because your identity is trying to hold its shape. The ego says, wait, if we step into that reality, who will we be? And because you don't have a clear answer, it pulls you back to the version of you it already knows. That's why so many dreams dissolve before they ever fully take form. Not because they're impossible, but because the ego clings to the familiar story. This is where contrast becomes your greatest ally. You must learn to clearly see the difference between the voice of your ego and the voice of your expanded self. The ego says, be careful. The expanded self says, be courageous. The ego says, what if it goes wrong? The expanded self says, what if this is everything you've been asking for? The ego whispers from the past. The expanded self speaks from the future. Every moment of resistance is actually an invitation to choose which voice you're going to trust. And here's the paradox: the more you fight the ego, the louder it becomes. Because what you resist persists. When you try to silence it, it interprets that as danger. It doubles down. But when you observe it, when you say, I hear you, but you don't get to decide for me anymore, its power starts to fade. This is not about spiritual bypassing or pretending you don't feel fear. It's about understanding where that fear comes from and refusing to let it steer the wheel. The quantum field doesn't respond to your words. It responds to your state, and your state is shaped by the story you believe. If your ego is broadcasting a frequency of fear, the field mirrors it back with experiences that match that fear. If your expanded self is broadcasting trust, the field mirrors trust. That's why inner alignment is the real work of manifestation. It's not about wanting harder. It's about shifting the signal you're sending. Think about every time you've tried to manifest something, and it felt like pushing a boulder uphill. That uphill push wasn't the universe being cruel. It was your ego resisting the frequency shift. It was trying to drag the old version of you into a new reality, and those two versions are not compatible. You can't bring the old identity into a new timeline and expect it to thrive. Something has to be released. And the moment you let it go, not just mentally, but emotionally, the resistance disappears like mist in sunlight. Let's make this real. Imagine someone who's always identified as the struggler. Their story is about overcoming hardship, fighting for every inch of progress. That story becomes a badge of honor. But when they try to manifest ease, their ego says, but if life becomes easy, who are you without the struggle? That question terrifies them on a subconscious level. So even though they consciously want ease, they unconsciously reject it. And the field, ever faithful, mirrors the unconscious rejection. The key is to create a new story that the ego can feel safe inside of. You can't bully the ego into silence. You have to invite it into a higher identity. That's why real manifestation work is often less about forcing change and more about integration. You're not trying to destroy the ego. You're teaching it to trust a new version of reality. This is where most people get stuck. They try to leap timelines while still emotionally living in the old one. They say affirmations about abundance while still identifying as broke. They visualize love while still identifying as unworthy. They speak of health while still identifying as sick. And because the ego sees no evidence of safety in the new reality, it clamps down like a lock. Manifestation isn't blocked because the field isn't responding. It's blocked because your identity is sending two conflicting frequencies at the same time. When you look closely, the ego has patterns. It reacts the same way whenever you approach the unknown. It raises doubt, brings up the past, and warns you of imagined dangers. Once you learn to recognize this pattern, you stop taking it personally. You stop believing its warnings are truth. You begin to see them for what they are: old programming trying to protect you. And the moment you stop believing those warnings, they lose their grip. True quantum manifestation happens in the space between who you are and who you're becoming. In that space, the ego will try to build bridges back to the old reality. But if you can hold your frequency steady, if you can remain in the vibration of the future identity long enough, the ego starts to relax. It starts to see that nothing catastrophic is happening. That's when the timeline shift becomes real. It's not about never feeling resistance again. It's about recognizing it as a sign that you're on the edge of expansion. Most people interpret resistance as a stop sign, but those who truly master manifestation see it as a green light. Resistance means the ego is being stretched, which means you're close to a breakthrough. When you understand this, you stop fearing resistance and start embracing it. The ego has no power except the power you give it. The moment you stop equating your identity with its voice, manifestation becomes simpler, not because the field suddenly becomes more generous, but because your signal stops being scrambled. When the frequency is clear, the response is immediate. And here's the deeper truth: the ego is not something you outgrow once and for all. It's something you learn to dance with. Each new level of your evolution brings a new layer of ego resistance. That's why personal growth isn't a one-time event, it's a spiral. Each turn brings you closer to alignment, not by eliminating resistance entirely, but by no longer letting it define your choices. The ego learns that it can trust the unknown because you've shown it time and again that expansion is safe. When the ego begins to relax, the field responds differently. Opportunities that were once invisible begin to appear. Synchronicities line up. Manifestations stop feeling forced and start feeling natural. It's like the universe was always waiting. But you had to clear the static first. There's a pivotal moment on every manifestation journey where you have to decide whether you're more loyal to your old identity or to the reality you desire. This is the moment most people avoid because it's uncomfortable. It's the moment where you're no longer who you were, but not yet who you're becoming. The ego hates this liminal space. It doesn't know how to label it, and labels are how it feels safe. So it tries to pull you back to what's familiar. That's why, when your manifestation is closest, your ego can become the loudest. It's like standing on the threshold of a new timeline, and your mind suddenly floods with reasons why you should turn back. Not because the future is wrong, but because it's unknown. The ego's greatest power isn't in stopping you. It's in convincing you to stop yourself. It whispers thoughts that sound like logic. This probably won't work. People like me don't get to have that. I've tried before and failed. And because these thoughts use your own voice, you trust them. But they're not truth. They're identity anchors. The ego is terrified of not knowing who you'll be once you step into that new reality. But the quantum field doesn't require you to know every step. It requires you to trust the frequency of the end result. This is why letting go is so powerful. Letting go isn't about giving up on what you want. It's about releasing your attachment to the old version of yourself that can't hold what you're calling in. It's about stepping beyond the ego's narrative. When you let go, you're telling the quantum field, I trust what's already done. And the field mirrors that trust back to you. But when you cling to control, your ego is the one broadcasting the signal, and the universe mirrors control, delay, and resistance. Consider how many times you've looped in the same cycle, desiring something, taking action, feeling doubt, pulling back, and then blaming fate. It's not fate. It's the ego's self-preservation loop. It's trying to keep you from collapsing the old timeline. And if you let it, it will. That's why awareness is your greatest power. When you can see the loop, you can step outside of it. And when you step outside of it, your reality bends. Most people think manifestation is about asking. It's not. It's about becoming. The moment your frequency matches the frequency of what you desire, reality has no choice but to align. But the ego clings to the old frequency because it's attached to a familiar story. So if you're still carrying an identity of lack, the field doesn't hear your affirmations of abundance. It hears the frequency of lack. That's why the ego must be softened, not ignored. Let's use a simple example: someone who wants to manifest love. They can visualize their ideal partner every night. They can journal, script, and set intentions. But if deep down they still identify as unworthy of love, or someone who always gets abandoned, their ego is in control of the broadcast. They'll unconsciously filter out opportunities that don't match that story. They might meet people who are aligned, but their mind will find ways to push them away or sabotage the connection. This isn't because love isn't available. It's because the ego's identity hasn't been updated to match the desired timeline. This is where embodiment comes in. When you embody the energy of the desired reality before it arrives, the ego loses its grip. It can't argue with a new identity that's already being lived. Embodiment doesn't mean faking it. It means shifting how you see yourself now. If you want to manifest abundance, you stop identifying as someone who's waiting for it, and start identifying as someone who already moves like it's inevitable. If you want love, you stop identifying as someone alone and start walking like someone already loved. The field isn't tricked by words, but it responds instantly to frequency. Ego resistance isn't proof that manifestation isn't working. It's proof that you're on the verge of an identity shift. The old identity fights the hardest just before it dissolves. That's why people often feel fear, doubt, or chaos right before a breakthrough. The ego senses the death of the old self and panics. But if you can hold your frequency through the panic, everything changes. It's like standing in a storm that tries to convince you it's permanent, when in truth, it's just the weather passing through. Every major manifestation in your life will require an identity death. That's the part most people skip because it feels too raw. But the ego can't exist in its old form in a new timeline. It has to adapt or fade. And the moment it does, the field doesn't delay. It responds. It's not personal. It's physics. There's another layer here that's subtle but powerful. The ego's addiction to struggle. Many people have unconsciously learned that struggle equals worth. They've been conditioned to believe that if something doesn't require suffering, it doesn't count. So even when the universe tries to give them ease, their ego rejects it. It looks for ways to complicate the journey. It questions easy blessings. It trusts pain more than peace. But the quantum field isn't impressed by effort. It responds to alignment. If your ego is addicted to proving itself through struggle, you'll manifest situations that require struggle. If your identity shifts to ease, ease will find you. The most radical thing you can do is to let manifestation be simple. This doesn't mean lazy or passive. It means aligned. It means allowing your future self to take the wheel instead of the ego. When you do this, the gap between desire and reality collapses, not because the universe suddenly favors you, but because you finally stopped resisting. When your ego starts telling you it's too late, too hard, or too much, that's your sign you're on the edge of the shift. The very resistance you feel is the indicator of how close you are. If you can train yourself to lean in instead of back away, to trust the unseen over the familiar, you'll break the pattern. You'll move from asking for a miracle to becoming the miracle. When you begin to truly understand the mechanics of ego resistance, something powerful happens. You stop blaming the universe for delays and start taking ownership of your vibration. You stop thinking manifestation is some external force playing favorites, and realize it's your inner alignment that shapes the timeline. This is where real mastery begins. Because once you're aware of how your ego creates friction, you can also consciously lower that friction. The quantum field isn't holding your dreams hostage, your attachment to the old self is. This is why so many people can visualize, journal, and affirm for years without tangible results. They're doing the right techniques with the wrong identity. Techniques are surface level, identity is frequency. If you're trying to manifest abundance but still secretly identify as someone who never has enough, the ego will override every affirmation. You can speak abundance all day, but the broadcast the field receives is scarcity. It's not punishing you. It's simply reflecting your dominant signal. The ego loves to keep you busy so you never notice this. It says, do more rituals, fix more blocks, read more books, work harder on healing. While the truth is, the fastest way to shift reality is to shift identity. Not someday, but now. The ego always places your arrival point in the future. It loves to say, once I feel worthy, I'll manifest. Once I heal, it will come. But the quantum field doesn't operate on linear time. It responds to now. If your ego is always promising to be ready tomorrow, tomorrow never comes. This is why stepping into the new identity before the physical evidence appears is so radical. It's not logical. It's quantum. The ego screams, how can I believe something I can't see yet? But that's exactly how the field works. What you believe first is what you see later. The ego wants proof before trust. Quantum manifestation requires trust before proof. The two realities can't coexist. You either choose the ego's way or the quantum way, and the one you choose determines the timeline you align with. To bypass ego resistance, you must become more loyal to the feeling of the future than the evidence of the present. If your current reality is showing you lack, but your desired reality is abundance, the ego will insist you be realistic. But being realistic is just another word for staying stuck. The future you want is not realistic to the ego, because the ego has never lived there. That's why your ego is not qualified to guide you into your next level. It only knows the past. Here's the thing. Your ego will fight for your limitations as if they're treasures. It will justify them. It will build stories around why things are hard for you, why other people have it easier, why it's too late, why it's too risky. And the more you argue with those stories, the more they strengthen. The trick is not to argue. The trick is to withdraw your agreement. When you stop agreeing with your limitations, They stop being real. Not because they never existed, but because your energy no longer sustains them. The ego is addicted to certainty. That's why stepping into the quantum unknown feels terrifying at first. But the unknown is the only place where new realities can be born. Everything you've already manifested exists inside your known zone. Everything you desire lives outside of it. The bridge between the two isn't more control, it's surrender. But not the kind of surrender that feels like defeat. The kind of surrender that feels like alignment, like finally allowing the river to carry you downstream instead of paddling upstream with blistered hands. When your ego resists, it's not trying to destroy you. It's just scared. It doesn't trust the unknown. That's why trying to crush it doesn't work. You can't bully fear into silence, but you can lead it with conviction. You can show your ego, over and over again, that expansion doesn't equal danger. That stepping into your next level doesn't mean death, it means evolution. And every time you do this, the resistance lessens. It doesn't disappear forever, but it becomes easier to navigate. The most dangerous thing your ego does is disguise itself as your intuition. It will sound wise, rational, protective. It will say things like, maybe it's not the right time. Maybe you should wait until things are more stable. But intuition expands you. Ego contracts you. One moves you forward. The other keeps you looping. The difference is in the energy behind the voice. If the thought brings peace, even if it stretches you, it's your higher self. If it brings tightness, fear, or shrinking, it's ego resistance dressed up as logic. Most people live their entire lives mistaking ego for intuition. That's why they never take the leap. That's why they keep circling around their potential like it's a distant star they can never touch. But the truth is, the distance isn't real. It's an illusion created by the ego to keep you safe. The moment you realize this, you can walk straight into what once felt unreachable. The ego also thrives on evidence. It constantly asks, where's the proof? And when it doesn't see immediate proof, it panics. But manifestation is delayed not because the field isn't listening, but because the ego refuses to trust long enough for the reality to stabilize. The field needs consistency. If you keep changing your frequency every time your ego gets nervous, the signal keeps scrambling. One day you're aligned with abundance. The next day you're doubting it. 1 week you're trusting. The next you're questioning. That inconsistency is why most people manifest in fragments instead of flows. If you want easeful manifestation, your loyalty must shift from the ego's panic to the quantum self-certainty. This doesn't mean pretending everything's fine when it isn't. It means holding your frequency even when the evidence hasn't caught up yet. It means becoming emotionally unavailable to doubt. It means treating the future as inevitable. Not because you're entitled to it, but because you're aligned with it. As you grow, your ego evolves too. It doesn't disappear, it just learns new ways to keep you safe. That's why every new level brings new resistance. The trick is not to wait for a day when resistance is gone. That day doesn't come. The real mastery is learning to move anyway, to hold the vibration anyway, to trust anyway. Because when you do, resistance shifts from being a wall to being a doorway. When you realize that resistance isn't the enemy but a signal, everything changes. Resistance isn't there to stop you. It's there to show you exactly where your identity is anchored. It's like a spotlight pointing at the gap between who you are now and who you're becoming. Most people interpret that feeling as failure or a sign that the universe isn't listening. But in truth, it's the clearest confirmation that you're standing at the edge of transformation. The ego's voice gets loudest not when you're far from the shift, but when you're about to cross it. The key isn't to silence that voice, it's to stop giving it authority. You can let the ego speak, but you don't have to let it lead. Think of it like a child throwing a tantrum in the backseat of a car. It can scream, it can cry, it can try to grab your attention, but it doesn't get to drive. You keep your hands on the wheel. You keep moving forward. Eventually, the tantrum loses its power because it doesn't change the direction. This is where inner safety comes in. Your ego only resists because it doesn't feel safe. It sees the unknown as a threat, even if it's a better future. So instead of fighting it, you can soothe it. You can say, I know this feels unfamiliar, but I've got us. We're safe. That internal reassurance is more powerful than any technique, because when the ego feels safe, it stops trying to sabotage. It relaxes its grip, and the field can finally deliver what's already aligned for you. Manifestation doesn't fail because the universe is ignoring you. It fails because your ego is broadcasting uncertainty while your conscious mind is broadcasting desire. That mixed frequency is like trying to tune into two stations at once. All you hear is static. The moment the ego softens and the signal becomes coherent, everything flows. It's not magic, it's coherence. This is why the most powerful manifestors aren't necessarily the most spiritual, disciplined, or talented. They're the ones who know how to hold a frequency without collapsing into ego panic. When the evidence isn't immediate, they understand that the gap between intention and manifestation isn't a void. It's a gestation period. It's where the old identity unravels and the new one takes root. And in that space, the ego will try to pull you back. If you can learn to stay centered there, your timeline bends faster. One of the ego's favorite tricks is urgency. It makes you believe you have to control every detail, that you're running out of time, that if you don't figure it out now, it's over. But urgency is just fear dressed up as productivity. When you make decisions from urgency, they're never aligned. They come from lack, not trust, and the field mirrors that. True manifestation isn't rushed, it's inevitable. When your identity is aligned, there's no panic. You move from a place of quiet certainty. Even if nothing external has shifted yet, consider how different that energy feels. Ego says, what if it doesn't work? Alignment says, of course it will. Ego says, I need proof to feel safe. Alignment says, I am safe and proof will follow. Ego tries to micromanage the how. Alignment surrenders the how and lives as if it's already done. This isn't blind faith. It's energetic strategy. The ego tries to control reality. The quantum self commands it through identity. The irony is that when you finally stop needing the manifestation to prove your worth, it comes. Because your worth was never missing. It was just buried under ego narratives. As long as the ego believes you need the external thing to feel complete, it creates resistance. But when you embody the energy of already being complete, the manifestation becomes inevitable. It's no longer a desperate grasp. It's a natural reflection. This is why so many breakthroughs happen when people finally let go. When they stop forcing, stop begging, stop doubting. When they say, I don't need to know how or when. I just know it's mine. The field isn't responding to their words. It's responding to their energetic posture. Letting go isn't giving up. It's stepping out of the ego's grip and into the frequency of certainty. Another subtle way the ego blocks manifestation is through comparison. It sees someone else living your dream and says, see, it's happening for them but not for you. It creates separation, but the quantum field is infinite. Someone else's manifestation doesn't take away yours. In fact, it's evidence that the frequency already exists in the field. The ego interprets it as proof of lack. The higher self sees it as proof of proximity. One contracts, the other expands. And then there's the ego's attachment to how it all has to look. It creates rigid expectations, the exact path, the exact timing, the exact form. When reality doesn't match that script, it declares failure. But the field often delivers in ways your ego can't predict. If you cling to one narrow doorway, you might miss the wide open gate right behind you. Surrendering control isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's knowing the how isn't your job, the frequency is. This is where true ease begins. When you stop gripping so tightly, the manifestation slips through effortlessly. It's like trying to hold water with clenched fists. It escapes. But open hands can hold anything. The ego's need to control suffocates the flow. Trust creates the space for it. The moment your ego accepts that the unknown isn't a threat but a canvas, everything shifts. Resistance becomes guidance, not a wall. Doubt becomes a signpost, not a verdict. Urgency fades into patience, and patience isn't waiting. It's confident allowing. This is where you stop chasing your manifestation and start magnetizing it. Because in the quantum field, what you are is louder than what you want. When your ego finally stops trying to prove, defend, or control, your identity expands. And when your identity expands, reality bends to match it. Not tomorrow, not someday, instantly. That's the law of coherence. That's how the ego stops blocking and starts serving.